Hey there. Tonight we're stepping into the shadows of forgotten civilizations, where truth is stranger than any fiction ever written. We're talking about ancient history facts, so shocking, so unbelievable, that they'll completely change how you see our ancestors. These aren't the sanitized stories from your textbooks. These are the raw, bizarre, and utterly mind-bending truths that historians whispered about in academic corners for decades. If learning about the wild, unfiltered reality of ancient times helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always strangely comforting to see who's out there falling asleep to the same incredible stories from our past. Why? So dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum and settle in. Because what you're about to discover will make you question everything you thought you knew about ancient civilizations. Let's begin with something that will immediately shatter your assumptions about the ancient world. The Great Pyramid of Giza wasn't built by slaves. This massive misconception has dominated popular culture for generations, but archaeological evidence tells a completely different story. Workers were actually well fed, respected craftsmen who lived in purpose-built villages near the construction site. They received regular medical care, quality food including meat and bread, and were even buried with honors near the pyramids they helped create. These weren't oppressed laborers dragging massive stones under the whip. They were skilled engineers, architects, and builders who took immense pride in their work. Graffiti found inside the pyramid shows work crews with names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure, suggesting a camaraderie and even humor among the builders. The logistics alone required incredible organization and respect for human resources. Speaking of Egypt, here's another fact that will blow your mind. Cleopatra lived closer in time to the moon landing than to the construction of the Great Pyramid. When we think of ancient Egypt as one continuous civilization, we're actually talking about a span of over 3,000 years. Cleopatra ruled in 30 BC, while the Great Pyramid was completed around 25 and 60 BC. That's a gap of 2,530 years. The moon landing happened in 1969 AD, just 1,199 years after Cleopatra's death. This puts ancient Egyptian civilization in stunning perspective. By Cleopatra's time, the Great Pyramid was already an ancient monument, weathered by millennia. She would have gazed upon it much like we might look at medieval castles today, with wonder at the achievements of distant ancestors. But let's travel to ancient Rome for a moment, because Romans had a relationship with urine that would shock modern sensibilities. They didn't just use it for cleaning, they treasured it. Roman women would pay premium prices for Portuguese urine, believing it had the finest whitening properties for their teeth. The ammonia in aged urine was indeed an effective cleaning agent, making teeth appear whiter, though at the cost of enamel damage we now understand. This wasn't limited to dental care. Romans collected urine in large public vessels for use in laundries, where it served as both a cleaning agent and fabric softener. The process was so integral to Roman society that Emperor Vespasian even taxed public urinals, leading to the famous phrase, "money has no odor," when his son complained about the undignified revenue source. Now let's discuss something that reveals just how different ancient priorities were from ours. In ancient Greece, olive oil was more valuable than gold in many contexts. This wasn't just for cooking. Olive oil was currency, medicine, fuel for lamps, and the foundation of personal hygiene. Greeks would cover their entire bodies in olive oil, then scrape it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil, removing dirt and dead skin in the process. Athletes would coat themselves in olive oil before competing, believing it enhanced their performance and protected their skin. The oil was so precious that stealing olives was punishable by death or exile in many Greek city-states. Entire economies rose and fell based on olive harvests, and the best oils were reserved for religious ceremonies and offerings to the gods. Here's something that will completely change how you picture ancient warfare. Vikings didn't actually wear horned helmets. This image comes entirely from 19th century Romantic art and Wagner's operas. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking helmets were simple, practical designs, often just a basic cap with a nose guard. Horns would have been tactically disastrous in combat, providing easy handholds for enemies and catching on branches during movement through forests. The misconception is so deeply embedded in popular culture that it's shocking to realize. Real Viking warriors wore practical leather and mail armor, carried round shields, and valued mobility over intimidating appearance. Their success came from superior shipbuilding technology, strategic raiding tactics, and sophisticated trading networks that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. But here's where Viking history gets truly bizarre. They used a navigation technique that sounds like pure fantasy, but was scientifically brilliant. Vikings navigated using special crystals called sunstones, which could locate the sun even through thick clouds or fog. These calcite crystals have unique optical properties that polarize light, allowing navigators to determine the sun's position with remarkable accuracy even in overcast conditions. Recent experiments have proven this technique works with stunning precision. Vikings could navigate across vast ocean distances using these crystals, combined with their knowledge of wind patterns, bird migration routes, and watercolor changes. This wasn't primitive guesswork, but sophisticated scientific navigation that enabled their incredible maritime achievements. Let's shift to ancient China, where they invented toilet paper in the 6th century AD, but only for emperors. The rest of the population used whatever was available: corn cobs, leaves, stones, or cloth. The imperial toilet paper was specially manufactured, perfumed, and considered so luxurious that using it without permission was a serious crime. This reveals the extreme stratification of ancient Chinese society. While common people struggled with basic hygiene needs, the imperial core enjoyed innovations that wouldn't reach Europe for another 1,000 years. The Chinese also invented paper money, the compass, gunpowder, and printing. But these technologies often remained restricted to the elite or specific government functions for centuries, before spreading to the general population. Here's something that shows just how advanced ancient engineering could be. Roman concrete was actually superior to modern concrete in many ways, particularly for underwater construction. They used volcanic ash from specific regions around Mount Vesuvius, creating a material that actually strengthened over time when exposed to seawater. Modern scientists have only recently figured out why this worked and are trying to recreate the formula. Roman harbors, bridges, and aqueducts built with this concrete have survived for 2,000 years, while modern concrete structures begin deteriorating within decades. The Romans achieved this without modern chemical knowledge, relying instead on centuries of experimentation and careful observation of natural materials. But perhaps nothing demonstrates ancient ingenuity like the Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a shipwreck off the Greek coast. This bronze device, dating to around 100 BC, is essentially an ancient computer designed to predict astronomical events. It contains dozens of precisely crafted gears and could calculate the positions of the sun, moon, and known planets decades into the future. The complexity is staggering. The mechanism predicted solar and lunar eclipses, tracked the 4-year cycle of the Olympic Games, and followed the complicated 19-year pattern of lunar phases. Nothing approaching this level of mechanical sophistication appeared in Europe again until astronomical clocks began appearing in the 14th century, over 1,000 years later. This discovery forces us to reconsider ancient technological capabilities. If Greeks in 100 BC could create mechanical computers, What other sophisticated devices existed that simply haven't survived? The mechanism suggests an entire tradition of precision engineering that was lost to history, leaving us with only tantalizing glimpses of what ancient craftsmen could achieve. Speaking of lost knowledge, ancient libraries contained wisdom we can barely imagine today. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a collection of books. It was a research institution where scholars from across the known world gathered to push the boundaries of human knowledge. They calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, understood the principles of steam power, and developed sophisticated medical procedures, including cataract surgery. When we think about the burning of Alexandria, we're not just talking about lost books. We're talking about the destruction of active research programs, experimental techniques, and accumulated knowledge that took centuries to redevelop. Some estimates suggest the library contained over 700,000 scrolls, representing the collected wisdom of the entire ancient Mediterranean world. Here's something that reveals the brutal realities behind ancient luxury. Purple dye, the color reserved for royalty, required the harvesting of thousands of murex snails for just a few ounces of dye. These sea snails had to be collected alive, their shells cracked open, and a tiny gland extracted and processed. The smell during production was so horrific that dye works had to be located far from populated areas. A single purple-dyed cloak could cost more than a common person's lifetime earnings. The color became so associated with power that in some periods, unauthorized wearing of purple was punishable by death. This wasn't just about fashion, it was about maintaining rigid social hierarchies through control of luxury goods. But ancient peoples found beauty in unexpected places. Romans collected and treasured bezoars, stones found in the stomachs of goats and other animals. These objects, formed when animals swallowed indigestible materials that gradually accumulated mineral deposits, were believed to have magical properties and could neutralize poisons. Wealthy Romans would pay enormous sums for particularly fine specimens. The belief in bezoar stones persisted for centuries and influenced medieval and Renaissance medicine. Kings and nobles would have cups made from bezoar material, believing it would protect them from assassination attempts. While we now know bezoars have no magical properties, they do contain some compounds that could theoretically absorb certain toxins, giving the superstition a tiny grain of scientific truth. Let's talk about ancient medicine, which combined genuine insights with practices that seem insane today. Ancient Egyptians performed brain surgery, set broken bones with sophisticated splints, and developed surgical techniques that wouldn't be improved upon for thousands of years. Yet they also believed that mental illness was caused by the heart wandering around inside the body, and that the best treatment involved drilling holes in the skull to let evil spirits escape. Egyptian medical papyri describe procedures for removing cataracts, treating wounds, and even performing what appears to be cosmetic surgery. They understood that the heart pumped blood and identified several internal organs correctly. But they also thought the brain was useless padding and routinely removed it during mummification, while carefully preserving supposedly more important organs like the liver. This combination of advanced knowledge and bizarre misconceptions characterized ancient medicine everywhere. Chinese doctors developed acupuncture and sophisticated herbal remedies that remain effective today, while also believing that illness was caused by imbalances between cosmic forces. Greek physicians like Hippocrates established principles of medical ethics still used today, while also practicing bloodletting and believing that women's health problems were caused by wandering wombs. Here's something that shows how different ancient concepts of time were from ours. Many ancient cultures didn't count years the way we do. Instead, they dated events by the reigns of kings, the terms of elected officials, or recurring natural phenomena. This meant that historical records from different regions were nearly impossible to correlate, and the concept of universal dating systems was completely foreign. Romans dated events from the founding of their city, Greeks used Olympic cycles, and Egyptians used the reigns of pharaohs. This created massive confusion when different cultures tried to coordinate activities or establish treaties. The concept of a universal calendar system was one of the most important administrative innovations in human history. Though we rarely think about how revolutionary the idea was, ancient peoples also had completely different relationships with animals than we do today. In ancient Egypt, killing a cat, even accidentally, was punishable by death. Cats were considered sacred to the goddess Bastet, and their protection was taken so seriously that Roman soldiers reportedly used this knowledge tactically, carrying cats on their shields, knowing Egyptians wouldn't risk harming them in battle. But the cat reverence went far beyond religious protection. When house cats died, Egyptian families would shave their eyebrows in mourning and mummify their pets with the same care given to human family members. Archaeologists have discovered enormous cat cemeteries containing thousands of mummified cats, each wrapped in linen and placed in individual wooden sarcophagi. This wasn't limited to cats. Egyptians mummified crocodiles, birds, fish, and virtually every other animal they considered sacred. The process was so extensive that millions of animal mummies have been discovered, representing a religious and economic system we can barely comprehend today. Let's discuss ancient entertainment, which often combined artistry with shocking brutality. Roman gladiatorial games weren't just fights to the death. They were elaborate theatrical productions with complex storylines, exotic animals, and sophisticated special effects. The Colosseum could be flooded for naval battles, fitted with elaborate stage machinery for dramatic presentations, and transformed into different environments using painted backdrops and movable scenery. But the scale of violence was staggering. During the inauguration of the Colosseum, games lasted for 100 days and resulted in the deaths of over 9,000 animals and thousands of human participants. These weren't just random fights, but carefully orchestrated spectacles designed to demonstrate Roman power and provide psychological release for urban populations. The logistics alone required incredible organization. Wild animals had to be captured across the empire and transported to Rome alive. Gladiators required extensive training, medical care, and equipment. The events needed coordination between animal handlers, stage crews, musicians, and security forces. These games represented one of the most sophisticated entertainment industries in human history, built entirely around organized violence. Ancient hunting practices reveal mindsets that would horrify us today. In medieval Europe, nobles participated in something called bat fowling, where they would sneak into forests at night with torches and nets. The bright lights would confuse roosting birds, causing them to fly directly into nets where they'd be captured alive. But this wasn't for food or necessity. It was considered refined entertainment for the wealthy, who found amusement in the panic and confusion of wild creatures. The practice extended to what they called fox tossing, where courtiers would gather in pairs holding opposite ends of slings. Foxes, rabbits, and other small animals would be released into the courtyard, and participants would attempt to launch them as high as possible using the slings. The animals rarely survived, but the height achieved was carefully measured and recorded as a competitive sport. These events were attended by royalty and considered the pinnacle of sophisticated recreation. Here's something that reveals the strange priorities of ancient warfare. Roman soldiers were paid partially in salt, which is where our word salary comes from. But salt wasn't just valuable as a preservative and flavoring agent. Roman military engineers used salt as a weapon of agricultural warfare. When they wanted to ensure a conquered territory could never rebel, they would sow the fields with salt, making the soil incapable of supporting crops for generations. This practice was so devastating that it became the ultimate expression of Roman dominance. The phrase, salting the earth, represented not just military victory, but the complete erasure of a civilization's ability to sustain itself. Carthage, Rome's greatest rival, allegedly received this treatment after the Third Punic War, though modern historians debate whether this actually occurred or was symbolic propaganda. But Romans found salt useful in ways that seem bizarre today. They believed that gladiators' sweat, mixed with salt from the arena sand, had powerful medicinal properties. Wealthy Roman women would pay enormous sums for small vials of this mixture, which they applied to their skin, believing it would preserve their youth and beauty. The practice was so popular that gladiator sweat became a luxury commodity traded throughout the empire. Let's talk about ancient beauty standards that would seem shocking today. In ancient China during the Song dynasty, foot binding became so extreme that women's feet were deliberately broken and reshaped into tiny curved appendages called lotus feet. The process began when girls were as young as 4 years old. Their toes would be broken and folded under the foot, then bound tightly with cloth strips that were gradually tightened over years. The result was feet that measured only 3 to 4 inches long, making normal walking impossible. Women with bound feet could only take tiny, shuffling steps, which was considered incredibly attractive and elegant. The practice was so valued that women with natural feet were virtually unmarriageable in upper-class society. This wasn't just about beauty standards, but about demonstrating that a family was wealthy enough to support women who couldn't perform physical labor. The pain was excruciating and never ended. Many women died from infections, gangrene, or complications from the binding process. Yet the practice continued for over 1,000 years because it represented the ultimate expression of feminine refinement and family status. Ancient Mayans had beauty modifications that seem equally extreme. They would deliberately cross babies' eyes by dangling objects in front of their faces for hours each day, believing that crossed eyes were a sign of divine favor. They also flattened infants' heads by binding them between wooden boards, creating elongated skulls that resembled their depictions of gods and nobles. But perhaps most shocking was their dental modification. Mayans would drill holes in their teeth and insert jade, obsidian, or gold ornaments directly into the enamel. This wasn't just for special occasions, but permanent body modification that served as both decoration and status symbol. The procedure was performed without anesthesia, using primitive stone tools, yet it was so popular that archaeologists regularly find elaborately modified teeth in Mayan burial sites. These modifications weren't random fashion choices, but reflected sophisticated understanding of social signaling and religious symbolism. Each type of modification indicated specific social rank, religious affiliation, and regional identity. A person's appearance instantly communicated their place in society to anyone who understood the visual code. Let's discuss ancient food preservation techniques that reveal incredible ingenuity born from desperate necessity. In Arctic regions, indigenous peoples developed a method of preserving meat that sounds absolutely revolting, but was nutritionally brilliant. They would stuff small birds like auks whole into seal skins, feathers and all, then sew the skins shut and allow natural fermentation to occur over several months. The result was called kiviak, and while it smells horrible to modern sensibilities, it provided essential vitamins during long Arctic winters when fresh food was impossible to obtain. The fermentation process created vitamin C that prevented scurvy, while the fat content provided necessary calories for surviving extreme cold. Families would share these fermented birds during the darkest months, eating them whole, including bones and feathers. This wasn't primitive ignorance, but sophisticated biochemistry, developed through centuries of experimentation. Arctic peoples understood nutrition science long before vitamins were discovered, creating preservation methods that maintained essential nutrients through chemical processes they couldn't explain but had perfected through trial and error. Ancient Scandinavians developed equally ingenious preservation techniques. They buried fish in sand mixed with salt and allowed controlled decomposition to occur over months. The resulting product, called rakfisk, was incredibly nutritious and could be stored for years without refrigeration. The fermentation process broke down proteins into easily digestible amino acids, while creating natural preservatives that prevented harmful bacteria growth. But the most shocking preservation method was practiced by certain Siberian tribes who would allow meat to freeze naturally, then bury it in permafrost for years or even decades. When retrieved, this meat was still perfectly edible and provided emergency food supplies that could sustain entire communities through catastrophic famines or harsh winters. Here's something that shows how different ancient concepts of medicine were. In ancient Greece, doctors believed that mental illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids called humours. They identified 4 primary humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much blood made someone overly cheerful and energetic. Too much phlegm caused laziness and dullness. Excess yellow bile created anger and irritability, while too much black bile led to depression and melancholy. Treatment involved rebalancing these humours through diet, exercise, bloodletting, or induced vomiting. Doctors would taste patients' urine to diagnose illness, believing that different flavours indicated specific imbalances. Sweet urine suggested excess blood, bitter urine indicated too much yellow bile, and salty urine meant phlegm predominance. This system seems absurd today, but it represented sophisticated attempts to understand human physiology and psychology. Greek doctors developed detailed treatment protocols based on humour theory that influenced medical practice for over 2,000 years. Some of their insights were remarkably accurate, even if their explanations were completely wrong. Ancient Egyptian medicine combined genuine surgical skill with practices that seem insane. They could perform cataract surgery, set complex bone fractures, and treat wounds with techniques that remained unsurpassed for centuries. Yet they also believed that the heart controlled thought and emotion, while the brain was useless stuffing that could be discarded during mummification. Egyptian doctors understood that pulse rates indicated health problems and developed sophisticated diagnostic techniques based on heart rhythm analysis. They created surgical instruments that were essentially unchanged until the modern era, and developed antiseptic practices that prevented infection long before germ theory was understood. But they also thought that illness could be caused by dead relatives becoming angry about improper burial procedures. Treatment often involved elaborate rituals to appease deceased family members, combined with practical medical interventions that actually worked. This combination of effective treatment and supernatural explanation characterized ancient medicine everywhere. Let's talk about ancient transportation that achieved incredible feats through pure human ingenuity. The Incas built a road system that stretched over 25,000 miles through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, all without wheeled vehicles or pack animals larger than llamas. These roads included suspension bridges spanning deep gorges, tunnels carved through solid rock, and elevated causeways crossing swamplands. The engineering was so sophisticated that many Inca roads are still in use today, over 500 years later. They understood principles of drainage, erosion control, and structural engineering that allowed their roads to survive earthquakes, floods, and centuries of weather. All of this was accomplished using only bronze tools, human labor, and accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. But the most impressive aspect was the communication system built around these roads. The Incas developed a relay network of runners called Chasqui, who could carry messages across the entire empire faster than any transportation system available until the telegraph was invented. These runners could cover over 150 miles per day, carrying detailed information encoded in knotted string systems called quipus. The Chasqui were so efficient that fresh fish caught on the coast could be delivered to mountain cities hundreds of miles inland while still fresh. This required precise timing, perfect physical conditioning, and logistical coordination that rivaled modern shipping networks. Ancient Polynesians achieved even more remarkable transportation feats using nothing but wind and ocean currents. They navigated across thousands of miles of open ocean in outrigger canoes, discovering and colonizing islands scattered across the Pacific. They did this without compasses, maps, or any navigation instruments we would recognize. Instead, they used a sophisticated system of reading wave patterns, wind directions, bird behavior, and celestial movements. Polynesian navigators could detect islands beyond the horizon by observing how ocean swells refracted around landmasses. They tracked seasonal migration patterns of seabirds to locate feeding areas that indicated nearby land. This knowledge was so complex that learning it required decades of training and practice. Navigation techniques were carefully guarded, secrets passed down through specialized families who served as maritime guides for entire cultures. The precision required was extraordinary. A single miscalculation could doom entire expeditions to death in the open ocean. Yet Polynesians successfully colonized islands across 10,000 miles of ocean, from Easter Island to New Zealand. They transported not just people, but entire agricultural systems, carrying seeds, livestock, and cultural knowledge to establish self-sufficient colonies on previously uninhabited islands. Here's something that reveals the sophisticated understanding ancient peoples had of astronomy and mathematics. The Mayans calculated the length of a solar year as 365.2420 days. Our modern calculation is 365.2422 days. They were accurate to within 2/10,000ths of a day, achieving this precision using only naked eye observation and mathematical techniques based on the number 20 rather than our base 10 system. This accuracy was essential for their agricultural calendar, which determined when to plant crops, harvest food, and perform religious ceremonies. Mayan astronomers tracked Venus cycles so precisely that they could predict its position centuries into the future. They understood that Venus appeared as both morning and evening star, representing the same celestial body observed at different times. But their mathematical achievements went far beyond astronomy. Mayans independently invented the concept of zero, a mathematical breakthrough that didn't occur in Europe until much later. They developed sophisticated algebraic techniques and could perform calculations involving numbers in the millions using their vigesimal counting system. Mayan architects used these mathematical insights to encode astronomical alignments into their buildings. Temples were positioned so that specific celestial events would be visible from designated viewing points. Doorways framed the rising sun on solstices, and window openings aligned with the maximum northern and southern positions of Venus. This integration of mathematics, astronomy, and architecture created monuments that functioned as both religious centers and scientific instruments. Standing in these ancient observatories today, you can still witness the celestial events that Mayan astronomers predicted over 1,000 years ago. Ancient Babylonians developed mathematical techniques that were equally sophisticated. They used a base 60 numbering system that we still use today for measuring time and angles. Their astronomical observations were so precise that modern computers have verified the accuracy of eclipse predictions made over 2,500 years ago. Babylonian mathematicians understood quadratic equations, geometric progressions, and trigonometric relationships centuries before these concepts were rediscovered in medieval Europe. They calculated square roots using iterative methods that are essentially identical to modern computational techniques. This mathematical sophistication enabled engineering achievements that seem impossible given their available tools. Babylonian architects could calculate the precise angles needed for arch construction, determine the load-bearing capacity of different materials, and design irrigation systems that required complex hydraulic engineering. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, required hydraulic engineering so sophisticated that some modern historians have questioned whether it actually existed. The system would have needed pumps capable of lifting water hundreds of feet, distribution networks that could irrigate terraced gardens, and drainage systems that prevented structural damage from water accumulation. Whether or not the Hanging Gardens actually existed Babylonian engineers certainly possessed the mathematical knowledge necessary to design such systems. Their understanding of physics, materials science, and hydraulics enabled architectural achievements that influenced construction techniques for thousands of years. But perhaps nothing reveals the shocking brutality of ancient medicine quite like trepanation, the practice of drilling holes directly into living skulls. This wasn't some rare, desperate procedure performed only in extreme circumstances. Archaeological evidence shows that trepanation was commonly practiced across virtually every ancient civilization, from the Inca High in the Andes to Celtic tribes in northern Europe. The survival rates were surprisingly high, with many skulls showing clear signs of healing around the drill holes, indicating patients lived for years or even decades after the procedure. Ancient surgeons developed sophisticated techniques for this operation, using bronze or obsidian tools to carefully remove circular sections of skull bone while keeping patients conscious throughout the entire process. What makes this even more shocking is that we still don't fully understand why they did it. Some cases clearly involved treating head injuries or removing bone fragments after trauma, but many trepanned skulls show no signs of injury or disease, suggesting the holes were drilled for spiritual or psychological reasons that remain completely mysterious to us today. Ancient Peruvian surgeons became so skilled at trepanation that they achieved success rates higher than many surgical procedures performed in Europe during the Middle Ages. They understood how to avoid critical brain areas, control bleeding, and prevent infection using natural antiseptics. Yet they performed these operations without anesthesia, relying on patients' ability to endure unimaginable pain. The psychological implications are staggering. Imagine lying fully conscious while someone slowly drills through your skull with primitive tools, knowing that the slightest mistake could mean instant death or permanent brain damage. Yet thousands of people willingly underwent this procedure, suggesting they believed the benefits outweighed the horrific risks. Here's something that will completely change how you think about ancient hygiene. Romans didn't use soap as we understand it. Instead, they covered their bodies in olive oil, then scraped it off using curved metal tools called strigils. This process was performed in public bathhouses, where dozens of people would gather to socialize while scraping oil and dead skin from each other's bodies. But the Romans took communal bathing to extremes that would shock us today. Public latrines were designed as social gathering places where people would sit side by side, conducting business meetings while relieving themselves. These facilities featured no privacy walls, no individual stalls, just long stone benches with holes cut at regular intervals. Romans shared communal sponges attached to sticks for cleaning themselves after using the latrine. These sponges were simply rinsed in running water or vinegar between uses, with no concept that they might be spreading disease. The same sponge might be used by dozens of people in a single day, creating conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. Yet somehow this system worked well enough that Roman cities supported populations larger than many modern metropolises. Their sophisticated sewage systems and running water infrastructure prevented the kinds of epidemic diseases that devastated medieval European cities centuries later. Let's discuss ancient warfare tactics that seem too bizarre to be real. During sieges, defenders would pour boiling oil on attacking soldiers, but oil was expensive and often unavailable. Instead, they frequently used boiling water, heated sand, or even human waste as defensive weapons. The psychological impact was often more effective than the physical damage. Byzantine armies developed a weapon called Greek fire, an incendiary mixture that burned even on water and couldn't be extinguished by conventional means. The exact formula was such a closely guarded state secret that it was eventually lost to history. Modern attempts to recreate Greek fire have failed to achieve the same devastating effectiveness described in historical accounts. But perhaps the most shocking ancient weapon was the use of diseased corpses as biological warfare. Attacking armies would catapult plague victims over city walls, deliberately spreading epidemic diseases among defenders. This tactic was so effective that some sieges were won entirely through biological contamination, without any conventional fighting. The Mongols perfected this technique during their conquests across Asia and Europe. They would collect bodies of plague victims from recently conquered cities and transport them to new targets specifically to spread disease. This systematic use of biological warfare contributed to the devastating spread of bubonic plague that killed millions across the medieval world. Ancient naval warfare involved tactics equally brutal and ingenious. Roman ships carried specialized boarding parties equipped with grappling hooks, portable bridges, and even trained attack animals. Some vessels transported live bears or lions that would be released onto enemy ships during close combat, creating chaos and terror among opposing crews. But the most feared naval weapon was something called liquid fire. Different from Greek fire, but equally terrifying. Ships would approach enemy vessels carrying large clay pots filled with burning oil, tar, and sulfur. These containers would be hurled onto enemy decks, where they would shatter and spread flames that were nearly impossible to extinguish with seawater. The psychological warfare extended beyond physical weapons. Ancient armies would deliberately mutilate captured enemies in visible ways, then release them to spread terror among opposing forces. Missing ears, noses, or hands served as walking advertisements for the brutality awaiting anyone who resisted. Here's something that reveals the strange relationship ancient peoples had with death and the afterlife. Egyptian mummification wasn't limited to preserving human bodies. They mummified millions of animals, including cats, dogs, birds, crocodiles, and even insects. These weren't just beloved pets, but religious offerings believed to carry messages to the gods. The scale was industrial. Archaeologists have discovered catacombs containing literally millions of mummified animals, each carefully wrapped and preserved using the same techniques applied to human pharaohs. The economic impact was enormous, supporting entire industries of embalmers, priests, and craftsmen who specialized in animal mummification. But here's the truly shocking part. Recent X-ray analysis of animal mummies has revealed that many contain no animal remains at all. Instead, they're stuffed with sticks, stones, or random debris wrapped to feel like a mummified creature. This suggests that ancient Egyptian mummification had become such big business that fraud was common, with dishonest embalmers selling fake animal mummies to unsuspecting customers. The religious implications are staggering. Devout Egyptians would pay enormous sums for mummified animals they believed would intercede with the gods on their behalf, only to discover they'd purchased bundles of garbage wrapped in expensive linen. Yet the practice continued for centuries, suggesting either widespread ignorance or acceptance of symbolic, rather than literal religious offerings. Ancient burial practices reveal mindsets that seem completely alien to modern sensibilities. Celtic Druids practiced something called triple death, where important individuals would be simultaneously hanged, drowned, and stabbed before burial. This wasn't punishment, but honor, ensuring the deceased could travel to all three levels of the Celtic afterlife. Archaeological evidence shows these triple deaths were performed with careful precision, suggesting elaborate rituals rather than random violence. The bodies would be preserved in peat bogs, where acidic conditions mummified them so perfectly that 2,000-year-old corpses still retain their hair, skin, and even stomach contents, showing their final meals. These bog bodies reveal shocking details about ancient life and death. Many show evidence of manicured fingernails and well-groomed hair, indicating they were high-status individuals rather than criminals or slaves. Their final meals often included exotic ingredients that would have been extremely expensive, suggesting ritual preparation for ceremonial death. But the most disturbing aspect is that many bog bodies show signs of willing participation in their own deaths. there's no evidence of struggle or attempts to escape. Instead, these individuals appear to have calmly accepted elaborate execution rituals that modern minds can barely comprehend. Let's talk about ancient entertainment that combined artistic sophistication with shocking brutality in ways that reveal completely different moral frameworks. Roman venaciones weren't just gladiator fights, but elaborate theatrical productions featuring exotic animals, complex storylines, and sophisticated special effects that could transform the entire Colosseum into different environments. The logistics were staggering. Wild animals had to be captured alive across the empire and transported to Rome in specially designed ships and wagons. Lions from North Africa, bears from Germania, elephants from Asia, all converged on Rome for public spectacles that lasted for days or even weeks at a time, but the scale of slaughter was almost incomprehensible. During a single day's entertainment, hundreds of animals might be killed along with dozens of human participants. The arena floor had elaborate drainage systems specifically designed to handle the massive amounts of blood generated during these events. What makes this even more shocking is that Romans saw these spectacles as sophisticated cultural events, comparable to opera or theatre today. Wealthy patrons would sponsor games the way modern philanthropists support arts organizations, viewing mass slaughter as a legitimate form of artistic expression and public service. The economic impact extended throughout the empire. Entire industries developed around capturing, training, and transporting animals for the arena. Professional animal hunters became wealthy specialists, while gladiator schools operated as sophisticated training facilities that combined athletic coaching with theatrical instruction. Yet archaeological evidence suggests that many gladiators were well-treated athletes rather than expendable slaves. They received quality medical care, specialized diets, and even fan followings comparable to modern sports stars. The mortality rate, while high by today's standards, was lower than often portrayed in popular culture. Here's something that shows how different ancient concepts of childhood were from ours. In Sparta, children were considered property of the state rather than their parents. Boys were removed from their families at age 7 and placed in military training programs that would horrify modern child welfare advocates. The agog system subjected children to deliberate starvation, exposure to extreme weather, and physical punishment designed to create perfect soldiers. Boys were given minimal clothing regardless of season, and were expected to find their own food through hunting or stealing. Getting caught stealing was punished not for the theft, but for the incompetence of being detected. But the most shocking aspect was the institutionalized violence between children. Boys were deliberately pitted against each other in contests that often resulted in serious injury or death. Survivors were praised, while those who showed weakness or compassion were subjected to additional punishment and humiliation. This wasn't considered child abuse, but essential education for producing warriors capable of defending Spartan society. The system was so successful that Spartan soldiers became legendary throughout the ancient world for their discipline, courage, and effectiveness in battle. Spartan girls underwent their own harsh training programs, though less extreme than those for boys. They were expected to participate in athletic competitions while nearly naked, practice gymnastics and wrestling, and develop physical strength that shocked visitors from other Greek cities where women lived secluded lives. The purpose was producing mothers capable of bearing strong children and managing households while their husbands were away on military campaigns. Spartan women enjoyed freedoms and responsibilities that were completely unknown in other ancient societies. But these privileges came at the cost of childhood experiences we would consider fundamental human rights. Ancient Roman adoption practices reveal equally shocking attitudes toward children and family relationships. Wealthy Romans regularly adopted adult men as their heirs, creating instant family relationships that had nothing to do with blood or affection. These adoptions were purely political and economic transactions designed to preserve family wealth and social status. Children could be sold by their fathers to settle debts, or abandoned if they were unwanted. Exposure of unwanted infants was so common that it was regulated by law rather than prohibited. Healthy children left at designated locations might be rescued and raised as slaves, while those with disabilities were typically left to die. Yet Romans also developed sophisticated educational systems and showed genuine affection for children who survived infancy. Wealthy families invested enormous resources in their children's education, hiring specialized tutors and sending them to study in Athens or other cultural centers. This combination of casual brutality and genuine care seems contradictory to modern sensibilities, but it reflected practical attitudes towards survival in societies where infant mortality rates approached 50%. Emotional investment in children was tempered by realistic expectations about their chances of reaching adulthood. Let's discuss ancient religious practices that seem too extreme to be real. Carthaginian child sacrifice was an occasional ritual, but systematic practice that continued for centuries. Archaeological evidence from sites called tophets shows thousands of urns containing burned infant remains, suggesting regular sacrifice of children to appease the gods during times of crisis. The scale was industrial, with some tophets containing over 20,000 urns representing centuries of child sacrifice. Inscriptions indicate that wealthy families voluntarily offered their firstborn children during plagues, famines, or military defeats, believing this would restore divine favor and protect the entire community. But recent analysis suggests the reality was even more disturbing. Many of the burned remains show signs of deliberate strangulation or suffocation before cremation, indicating children were killed specifically for ritual purposes, rather than dying from natural causes and then being offered to the gods. The economic implications were staggering. Families would sometimes spend fortunes on elaborate ceremonies surrounding child sacrifice, commissioning expensive urns, hiring priests, and providing costly offerings to accompany their children's remains. This created entire industries based on ritualized infanticide. Celtic Druids practiced human sacrifice on scales that shocked even battle-hardened Roman soldiers. Archaeological evidence shows that Druids would sacrifice dozens of people at once during major religious festivals, using methods specifically designed to prolong suffering and maximize the spiritual value of the deaths. Bog bodies preserve evidence of these sacrificial practices in gruesome detail. Victims were often tortured for days before being killed, with evidence of repeated beatings, partial strangulation, and deliberate mutilation before final death. The preservation conditions allow forensic analysis that reveals the step-by-step process of these ritualized murders. But the most disturbing aspect is that victims appear to have been volunteers rather than prisoners or slaves. Analysis of bog bodies shows evidence of good nutrition, manicured nails, and expensive clothing, suggesting high-status individuals who willingly participated in their own sacrificial deaths. This challenges our understanding of ancient religious motivation. These weren't desperate people seeking escape from miserable lives, but apparently prosperous individuals who chose ritual death for reasons we can barely comprehend today. Ancient Germanic tribes practiced seasonal human sacrifice that was considered essential for agricultural success. Entire communities would gather for ceremonies where carefully selected individuals would be killed using methods designed to honor specific gods associated with different crops and seasons. The victims were often chosen years in advance and lived as honored members of their communities while preparing for their eventual sacrificial deaths. They received special treatment, expensive food, and were consulted as oracles because their approaching death was believed to give them supernatural insights. But archaeological evidence reveals that these sacrificial ceremonies often involved multiple victims killed simultaneously using different methods. Some were hanged, others drowned, still others burned alive, all during single ritual events designed to ensure comprehensive divine approval for the coming agricultural season. The communities that practiced these sacrifices were often prosperous agricultural societies, suggesting that ritualized murder was seen as a successful strategy for ensuring crop yields and community survival. The correlation between sacrifice and prosperity reinforced beliefs in its effectiveness for centuries. Here's something that shows how different ancient concepts of justice were from ours. Viking legal systems included a practice called holmgang, where legal disputes were settled through single combat rather than evidence or testimony. This wasn't primitive barbarism, but sophisticated legal procedure with elaborate rules and ceremonial requirements. The combat took place on a small island or marked ground with specific weapons, time limits, and victory conditions predetermined by legal tradition. Participants could hire champions to fight on their behalf, creating a class of professional legal combatants who specialized in resolving disputes through violence. But the most shocking aspect was that holmgang was considered more reliable than witness testimony or physical evidence. Vikings believed that the gods would ensure victory for whichever party was telling the truth, making trial by combat a form of divine judgment rather than simple violence. This system actually worked reasonably well for resolving disputes in societies where written records were rare and witness testimony was unreliable. The threat of having to fight to the death encouraged honest dealing and discouraged frivolous lawsuits. Roman legal procedures included practices equally shocking to modern sensibilities. Torture was routinely used to extract testimony from slaves, and sometimes from citizens accused of serious crimes. The methods were specifically designed to produce maximum pain while keeping victims alive and conscious for extended periods. But Romans developed sophisticated legal theories about when torture was appropriate and what kinds of testimony it could produce. They understood that extreme pain might cause false confessions, so they created elaborate rules about how tortured testimony should be evaluated and corroborated. The contradiction between brutal interrogation methods and sophisticated legal reasoning reveals how different ancient moral frameworks were from ours. Romans could simultaneously develop principles of legal procedure that influenced law for centuries, while accepting practices we would consider unconscionable violations of human rights. Ancient Chinese justice systems included punishments so elaborate they seemed designed more to satisfy artistic sensibilities than practical deterrence. The death of 1,000 cuts involved precisely controlled mutilation, designed to keep victims conscious and suffering for hours or even days before death finally occurred. But the most shocking aspect was that these punishments were considered merciful alternatives to simpler execution methods. The prolonged suffering was believed to allow criminals time for spiritual reflection and repentance that would improve their prospects in the afterlife. Executioners became skilled specialists who trained for years to perfect techniques that would maximize suffering while preserving life for as long as possible. These individuals were respected members of society rather than social outcasts, viewed as providing essential services for both legal and spiritual purposes. The audiences for these executions were often larger than those attending theatrical performances or religious festivals. Public torture was considered both entertainment and moral education, demonstrating the consequences of criminal behavior while providing spectacle for mass audiences. Let's talk about ancient economic systems that operated on principles completely alien to modern capitalism. In many societies, wealth was considered dangerous spiritual contamination that needed to be regularly purged through elaborate gift-giving ceremonies that could bankrupt entire families. Pacific Northwest potlatch ceremonies required chiefs to give away or destroy enormous quantities of valuable goods to demonstrate their spiritual power and social status. Families would spend years accumulating wealth specifically for the purpose of destroying it in public displays designed to shame their rivals and prove their supernatural connections. The economic impact was staggering. Entire communities would work for months preparing goods that would be burned, broken, or thrown into the ocean during potlatch celebrations lasting for days. From a modern perspective, This seems like massive waste of resources and labor, but the system actually functioned as sophisticated wealth redistribution that prevented dangerous accumulations of power while ensuring that resources reached communities throughout the region. Chiefs who hoarded wealth lost social status, while those who gave generously gained influence and respect. Ancient Mesopotamian economies operated on principles equally foreign to modern thinking. Debt forgiveness was regularly mandated by royal decree, with kings periodically cancelling all debts throughout their kingdoms to prevent the accumulation of unpayable obligations that could destabilize society. These Jubilee years weren't acts of royal generosity, but practical economic policy designed to prevent debt slavery from creating permanent underclasses that could threaten political stability. The regular cancellation of debts encouraged lending and economic activity while preventing the social disruption caused by extreme inequality. But the most shocking aspect was that these debt forgiveness programs were considered essential religious obligations rather than economic policies. Kings who failed to cancel debts were believed to lose divine approval, making periodic wealth redistribution a matter of spiritual as well as political necessity. The system worked so well that it persisted for thousands of years across multiple civilizations, suggesting that ancient peoples understood economic principles that modern societies have forgotten or deliberately abandoned. Here's something that will completely change how you think about ancient technology and engineering. The Damascus steel produced by medieval Islamic smiths was superior to any steel manufactured in Europe until the Industrial Revolution, yet the techniques for creating it were completely lost and have never been successfully reproduced. The steel could be folded thousands of times without breaking, held edges sharp enough to cut silk scarves dropped on the blade, and showed distinctive watered patterns that made each sword unique. European knights would pay enormous sums for Damascus weapons, which were considered almost magical in their effectiveness. But the most shocking aspect is that we still don't understand how Damascus steel was made. Modern metallurgists, using electron microscopes and sophisticated chemical analysis, have identified some of the materials and techniques involved, but every attempt to recreate authentic Damascus steel has failed to match the original properties. This suggests that medieval Islamic craftsmen possessed technological knowledge that was more advanced than our current understanding. They achieved results through empirical experimentation and accumulated tradition that modern science cannot duplicate despite having far superior analytical tools. The loss of Damascus steel technology represents one of the most dramatic examples of knowledge disappearing from human civilization. Within a few generations, techniques that had been perfected over centuries vanished completely, leaving only the finished products as evidence of what had been possible. Ancient Roman concrete technology presents a similar mystery. Their concrete was not only more durable than modern concrete, but actually strengthened over time when exposed to seawater. Roman harbour installations built 2,000 years ago are still structurally sound, while modern concrete begins deteriorating within decades. The key ingredient was volcanic ash from specific deposits around Mount Vesuvius, but the exact proportions and mixing techniques remain unclear. Modern attempts to recreate Roman concrete have achieved some success, but none have matched the longevity and strength of original Roman construction. This technological superiority was achieved without modern chemistry or materials science, relying instead on centuries of experimentation and careful observation of natural materials. Roman engineers understood principles of hydraulic chemistry that weren't formally discovered until the 20th century. The implications are staggering. If ancient peoples could develop superior technologies through empirical methods, what other knowledge might have been lost when their civilizations collapsed? How many technological advances have we had to rediscover because the original techniques were forgotten? Ancient optical technology reveals similar mysteries. The Nimrud lens, discovered in ancient Assyria, shows evidence of sophisticated grinding and polishing techniques that produced optical clarity comparable to modern manufactured lenses. Yet no other examples of such advanced optical work have survived from ancient times. This single artifact suggests that ancient peoples possessed knowledge of optics and lens making that was far more advanced than previously believed. The lens could have been used for magnification, fire starting, or even primitive telescopic observation, yet we have no written records describing how it was made or used. The existence of advanced ancient technologies that were subsequently lost challenges our assumptions about linear technological progress. Instead of steady advancement, human knowledge appears to have developed in cycles, with sophisticated techniques sometimes disappearing entirely before being rediscovered centuries or millennia later. These examples remind us that ancient peoples were not primitive versions of ourselves, but fully intelligent humans who developed solutions to complex problems using different approaches than we might choose today. Their achievements often surpassed our own, even without the theoretical frameworks we consider essential for advanced technology. The humbling reality is that despite our modern advantages, we sometimes cannot match the practical achievements of civilizations that possessed nothing but human ingenuity, careful observation, and accumulated wisdom passed down through generations of craftsmen who treated their knowledge as sacred trust rather than commercial commodity. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let these incredible truths about our ancestors settle in your mind. The ancient world was far stranger, more sophisticated, and more brutal than we ever imagined. These weren't primitive people stumbling through history, but complex civilizations with knowledge, technologies, and practices that continue to amaze and baffle us today. Sweet dreams, and remember that the past holds secrets we're still trying to understand. Ancient Persian kings practiced a form of punishment so elaborate it seems designed by nightmares themselves. The condemned would be trapped between two boats, with their head, hands, and feet protruding through holes. They'd be force-fed milk and honey until they developed explosive diarrhea, attracting swarms of insects that would slowly consume them alive over days or weeks. This wasn't reserved for the worst criminals, but was considered an honorable death for those who had offended royal dignity. The Persians called this scaphism, and historical accounts describe victims surviving for up to 17 days while being eaten alive by insects attracted to their bodily fluids. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical suffering, as victims remained fully conscious throughout their slow consumption by nature itself. But Persian justice had even stranger aspects. They practiced a legal principle where criminals could escape punishment by proving their good deeds outweighed their crimes. This wasn't just about major acts of heroism, but included every kind gesture, charitable donation, and moment of compassion throughout their entire lives. Court officials would literally weigh evidence of kindness against evidence of wrongdoing to determine sentences. This created a society where people obsessively documented their good deeds, keeping detailed records of every charitable act and kind word spoken. Persian nobles employed scribes whose sole job was recording evidence of their master's virtue, creating vast archives of documented compassion that could be presented during legal proceedings. Ancient Aztec religious ceremonies involve practices so extreme they challenge our understanding of human psychology. During festivals honoring the god Siptotec, priests would carefully flay living victims, removing their skin in single intact pieces. The priests would then wear these human skins for 20 days, believing this allowed them to channel the god's power of renewal and rebirth. The flaying was performed with obsidian knives so sharp they could remove skin without damaging the underlying muscle tissue. The process required extraordinary surgical skill and was considered the highest form of religious artistry. Priests trained for years to master techniques that would keep victims alive throughout the entire procedure. But the most disturbing aspect was that many victims volunteered for these rituals. Archaeological evidence suggests that being chosen for flaying was considered a tremendous honor, with families competing for the privilege of offering their relatives to the gods. The victims would fast and purify themselves for months, before their ceremonial death. The economic impact was enormous. Families would bankrupt themselves providing elaborate costumes, jewelry, and offerings for their sacrificed relatives. Entire industries developed around producing the specialized tools, ceremonial garments, and ritual paraphernalia required for these human flaying ceremonies. Here's something that reveals just how different ancient concepts of medicine were. Byzantine physicians believed that looking at beautiful objects could literally cure disease. They developed elaborate therapeutic programs where patients would be surrounded by artwork, precious gems, and attractive people while receiving treatment for various ailments. This wasn't just psychological comfort, but sophisticated medical theory based on the belief that beauty entered the body through the eyes and could rebalance corrupted humors that caused illness. Wealthy Byzantines would commission specific artworks designed to treat their particular medical conditions, creating custom therapeutic environments. The practice extended to what they called ocular medicine, where physicians would prescribe specific visual experiences as treatments. Patients with digestive problems might be required to stare at green objects for hours each day. Those suffering from fever would be surrounded by blue decorations and forced to observe cool, calming imagery. Byzantine medical texts describe detailed protocols for these visual therapies, including precise instructions about lighting conditions, viewing distances, and exposure durations. The treatments were so popular that specialized therapeutic art became a major Byzantine industry, with artists training specifically to create medically effective imagery. Ancient Celtic druids possessed knowledge that seems almost supernatural in its sophistication. They could predict eclipses decades in advance using wooden calculating devices that have completely disappeared from the archaeological record. Roman writers described these instruments as incredibly complex machines with hundreds of moving parts, yet not a single example has survived. The Druids also practiced a form of divination that involved interpreting the flight patterns of ravens released during specific weather conditions. They claimed these birds could carry messages between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, providing information about future events and hidden knowledge. But perhaps most shocking was their use of human heads as oracles. Celtic warriors would preserve the heads of defeated enemies using secret techniques that kept the brain tissue intact for months or even years. These preserved heads were consulted for advice on military strategy, agricultural decisions, and religious matters. Archaeological evidence confirms that head preservation was widespread among Celtic peoples, with specialized buildings constructed specifically for storing and consulting these grisly oracles. The heads were treated with enormous respect and were believed to retain the knowledge and personality of their original owners. Roman writers described witnessing consultations where druids would ask questions of preserved heads and interpret their responses based on subtle changes in facial expression or the movement of facial muscles as the tissue decomposed. This practice continued for centuries until Roman conquest destroyed the Druidic traditions. Let's talk about ancient Chinese innovations that seem too bizarre to be real. During the Tang dynasty, wealthy women would bind live crickets to their clothing as living jewelry. These insects were carefully selected for their musical qualities and were kept in tiny golden cages worn as decorative accessories. The practice required incredible skill in insect husbandry. Cricket trainers would spend months conditioning individual insects to sing on command, teaching them to respond to specific hand signals or musical notes. The most talented crickets could be worth more than houses, creating an entire economy based on insect performance. But the fashion extended beyond simple decoration. Chinese nobles would stage elaborate cricket concerts where dozens of trained insects would perform synchronized musical arrangements. These events were considered the height of sophistication, with critics evaluating the harmony, timing, and emotional expression of cricket performances. The psychological implications are staggering. These insects lived for only a few months, meaning that cricket trainers were constantly replacing their performers while maintaining the illusion of continuity. Wealthy patrons would form emotional attachments to specific crickets, mourning their deaths and commissioning elaborate funeral ceremonies when their favorite performers died. Ancient Egyptian mortuary practices included techniques so sophisticated they surpass modern embalming methods. They could preserve bodies so perfectly that skin texture, hair color, and even facial expressions remained intact for thousands of years. Yet the most advanced preservation was reserved not for pharaohs, but for sacred animals that were mummified in quantities that boggle the mind. Archaeologists have discovered catacombs containing literally millions of mummified cats, each individually wrapped and preserved using techniques that varied depending on the animal's perceived spiritual importance. The economic scale was staggering, with entire cities devoted to animal mummification, employing thousands of embalmers, priests, and craftsmen. But recent analysis has revealed something shocking about these animal mummies. Many contain no animal remains at all, instead being filled with sticks, stones, or random debris wrapped to simulate mummified creatures. This suggests that Egyptian animal mummification had become such big business that fraud was widespread. The implications are disturbing. Devout Egyptians would pay fortunes for mummified animals they believed would intercede with the gods on their behalf, only to receive bundles of garbage wrapped in expensive linen. Yet the practice continued for centuries, indicating either massive deception or acceptance that symbolic offerings were as spiritually effective as genuine ones. Ancient Roman dinner parties featured entertainment that would horrify modern guests. Wealthy Romans would stage elaborate executions during meals, with condemned criminals being killed in creative ways designed to amuse dinner guests while they ate. These weren't occasional spectacles, but regular features of upper-class social gatherings. The executions were choreographed like theatrical performances, with condemned prisoners forced to reenact mythological stories that ended in their actual deaths. Diners would critique the artistic merit of different killing methods while enjoying multiple courses of exotic foods. But the most disturbing aspect was the integration of violence with dining. Romans developed specialized furniture that allowed dinner guests to recline comfortably while watching executions, with viewing angles carefully calculated to provide optimal sightlines to the killing area. The timing of deaths was coordinated with meal service, so that climactic moments coincided with the arrival of specific dishes. This wasn't considered barbaric entertainment, but sophisticated cultural refinement that demonstrated the host's wealth, creativity, and power over life and death. The ability to casually orchestrate human executions while maintaining elegant dinner conversation was viewed as the ultimate expression of Roman civilization. Here's something that shows how different ancient concepts of childhood were. In ancient Carthage, children were regularly sacrificed to ensure military victories, with parents voluntarily offering their offspring during times of crisis. Archaeological evidence from sites called Tophets shows thousands of urns containing cremated infant remains, representing centuries of systematic child sacrifice. The scale was industrial, with some sites containing over 20,000 urns, representing generations of sacrificed children. Inscriptions indicate that wealthy families competed to offer the most valuable children, believing that sacrificing healthy, well-cared-for infants would be more pleasing to the gods than offering sick or unwanted babies. But analysis of the remains reveals something even more disturbing. Many show evidence of deliberate strangulation or suffocation before cremation, indicating children were killed specifically for ritual purposes rather than dying naturally and then being offered as sacrifices. The systematic nature suggests organized infanticide on a scale that challenges our understanding of ancient parental psychology. The families who practiced these sacrifices were often prosperous merchants and nobles, not desperate people driven by poverty or desperation. They would spend enormous sums on elaborate ceremonies surrounding their children's deaths, commissioning expensive urns, hiring priests, and providing costly grave goods to accompany their sacrificed offspring. Ancient Germanic tribes practiced seasonal human sacrifice that was considered essential for agricultural success. entire communities would gather for ceremonies where carefully selected individuals would be killed, using methods designed to honor specific gods associated with different crops and weather patterns. The victims were often chosen years in advance and lived as honored members of their communities while preparing for their eventual sacrificial deaths. They received special treatment, expensive clothing, and were consulted as oracles because their approaching death was believed to give them supernatural insights into future events. Archaeological evidence shows that these sacrificial ceremonies often involved multiple victims killed simultaneously using different methods. Some were hanged, others drowned, still others burned alive, all during single ritual events designed to ensure comprehensive divine approval for the coming agricultural season. The bog bodies preserved in northern European peat swamps provide gruesome evidence of these practices. Many show signs of elaborate torture before death, including repeated beatings, partial strangulation, and deliberate mutilation designed to prolong suffering and maximize the spiritual value of their deaths. But perhaps most disturbing is that victims appear to have been willing participants rather than prisoners or slaves. Analysis shows evidence of good nutrition, manicured nails, and expensive clothing, suggesting high-status individuals who voluntarily chose ritual death for reasons we can barely comprehend today. Let's discuss ancient hunting practices that reveal mindsets completely alien to modern sensibilities. Medieval European nobles participated in something called human hunting, where peasants would be released into forests and hunted like wild animals for the entertainment of aristocratic parties. These weren't executions disguised as sport, but elaborate recreational activities with complex rules governing how human prey could be captured or killed. The peasants were sometimes given head starts or provided with basic weapons, creating the illusion of fair play, while ensuring the outcome remained entertaining for the hunters. The psychological preparation was as elaborate as the physical hunt. Nobles would spend days planning strategies, selecting weapons, and coordinating with packs of specially trained hunting dogs, bred to track human scent rather than animal quarry. The hunts were social events with spectators, refreshments, and prizes for the most creative kills. But the most shocking aspect was that these human hunts were considered legitimate legal proceedings. Peasants accused of poaching, theft, or other crimes against noble property could be sentenced to serve as human prey, with their survival or death during the hunt determining their legal fate. The practice was so widespread that specialized equipment was developed specifically for human hunting. Nets designed to entangle running people, spears weighted for throwing at human targets, and even specialized arrows that would cause maximum pain without immediately killing the victim, were manufactured by craftsmen who took pride in their technical expertise. Ancient Viking berserkers achieved their legendary battle fury through practices that seemed too extreme to be believable. They would consume mixtures of psychoactive mushrooms, fermented animal blood, and other substances that induced states of consciousness so altered they believed they had transformed into bears or wolves. The transformation rituals were elaborate ceremonies that could last for days. Berserkers would fast, meditate, and undergo painful rituals designed to break down their normal human consciousness and allow animal spirits to possess their bodies. They would practice fighting techniques while in altered states, learning to channel their drug-induced fury into effective combat tactics. But the most disturbing aspect was that berserkers couldn't control when these transformations would occur. The combination of psychological conditioning and chemical substances created individuals who could enter homicidal rages triggered by relatively minor stimuli. They were as dangerous to their own allies as to enemies, requiring careful management by Viking commanders. Archaeological evidence suggests that berserker transformation was irreversible for some individuals. Skeletal remains show evidence of repeated self-inflicted injuries, suggesting that some berserkers continued their violent behaviors even outside of battle contexts, unable to return to normal human consciousness. The social implications were staggering. Berserkers were simultaneously revered as elite warriors and feared as unpredictable threats to community safety. They lived on the margins of Viking society, respected for their battlefield effectiveness, but isolated due to their psychological instability. Here's something that reveals the sophisticated cruelty of ancient justice systems. Chinese courts during the Ming Dynasty employed professional torturers who trained for years to master techniques that could keep victims alive and conscious for weeks, while inflicting maximum pain. These specialists were respected members of society rather than social outcasts, viewed as providing essential services for both legal and spiritual purposes. They developed elaborate tools and procedures that were passed down through generations of families who took pride in their technical expertise and artistic creativity. The most skilled torturers could control exactly how long victims would survive, timing their deaths to coincide with specific legal or ceremonial requirements. This wasn't random cruelty, but precise technical work that required deep understanding of human anatomy, pain psychology, and the spiritual beliefs that justified prolonged suffering. But the most shocking aspect was that torture was considered merciful compared to simple execution. The prolonged agony was believed to allow criminals time for spiritual reflection and repentance that would improve their prospects in the afterlife, making torture a form of compassionate religious service. The audiences for these torture sessions were often larger than those attending theatrical performances or religious festivals. Public torture was considered both entertainment and moral education, demonstrating the consequences of criminal behavior while providing spectacle for mass audiences who viewed the proceedings as sophisticated cultural events. Ancient Polynesian navigation techniques achieved feats that seem impossible even with modern technology. They could detect islands beyond the horizon by reading subtle changes in wave patterns, wind directions, and bird behavior with accuracy that surpassed contemporary GPS systems. The knowledge was so complex that learning it required decades of training under master navigators who guarded their techniques as sacred secrets. Students would spend years memorizing thousands of star positions, wave patterns, and natural indicators that could be used to determine location and direction across vast stretches of empty ocean. But the most remarkable aspect was their ability to navigate in complete darkness during storms or overcast conditions. Polynesian navigators could determine their position by feeling wave movements through the hulls of their canoes, detecting subtle changes in water temperature and current direction that indicated proximity to land. This sensory navigation was so sophisticated that navigators could predict weather changes days in advance, locate specific islands from hundreds of miles away, and maintain accurate course headings without any visible reference points. The techniques required not just intellectual knowledge, but physical conditioning that allowed navigators to detect environmental changes through their bodies. The psychological demands were equally extreme. Navigators had to maintain absolute concentration for weeks at a time, constantly processing sensory information while making split-second decisions that could mean life or death for entire expeditions. The mental discipline required was comparable to that achieved by advanced meditation practitioners. Let's talk about ancient medical practices that combine genuine insights with procedures that seem designed by madmen. Roman physicians would deliberately infect patients with malaria to treat other diseases, believing that high fevers could burn away corrupted humours responsible for various ailments. This wasn't random experimentation, but systematic medical practice, based on detailed theories about disease causation and treatment. Roman doctors developed elaborate protocols for inducing controlled malaria infections, timing the fever cycles to coincide with specific treatment objectives. The survival rates were surprisingly high for some conditions, suggesting that fever therapy occasionally worked despite being based on completely incorrect medical theories. Modern research has confirmed that high fevers can indeed boost immune system function, giving these ancient treatments accidental scientific validity. But Roman medicine also included practices that were purely destructive. They would burn patients with hot irons to create drainage points for imaginary toxic substances, drill holes in skulls to release evil vapors, and prescribe medicines containing mercury, lead, and other substances that were more poisonous than the diseases they were supposed to treat. The contradiction between effective treatments and deadly procedures reveals how ancient medicine operated through trial and error rather than systematic understanding. Successful treatments were preserved alongside harmful ones, creating medical traditions that could simultaneously heal and kill patients, depending on which procedures were applied. Ancient Egyptian surgical techniques achieved remarkable sophistication in some areas while remaining primitive in others. They could perform cataract surgery, set complex bone fractures, and remove tumors using procedures that wouldn't be improved upon for thousands of years. Egyptian surgical instruments were essentially unchanged until the modern era, with knives, forceps, and probes that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and surgical requirements. They developed antiseptic techniques using honey and other natural antibiotics that prevented infection long before germ theory was understood. But they also believed that the heart controlled all thought and emotion, while the brain was useless stuffing that could be discarded during mummification. This fundamental misunderstanding of basic anatomy coexisted with surgical skills that modern doctors would respect. Egyptian doctors understood that pulse rates indicated health problems and developed diagnostic techniques based on heart rhythm analysis that remained standard medical practice until the development of modern cardiology. They could identify heart disease, recognize signs of internal bleeding, and predict death with remarkable accuracy. Yet they also thought that illness could be caused by angry dead relatives, evil spirits entering through body openings, or cosmic forces disrupting the balance of internal fluids. Treatment often combined effective medical procedures with elaborate rituals designed to appease supernatural forces. Here's something that shows how different ancient concepts of wealth and poverty were from ours. In many Native American societies, the poorest person was considered the most spiritually powerful because they had given away everything they owned to help others in need. Wealth accumulation was viewed as spiritual contamination that needed to be regularly purged through elaborate gift-giving ceremonies that could bankrupt entire families. Chiefs were expected to demonstrate their virtue by giving away all their possessions during public festivals designed to shame rivals and prove supernatural connections. The economic impact was staggering, with entire communities working for months to prepare goods that would be destroyed or given away during potlatch celebrations lasting for days. From a modern perspective, this seems like massive waste of resources and human labor. But the system actually functioned as sophisticated wealth redistribution that prevented dangerous concentrations of power while ensuring resources reach communities throughout vast regions. Leaders who hoarded wealth lost social status, while those who gave generously gained influence and respect. Ancient Mesopotamian economies operated on principles equally foreign to modern thinking. Kings would periodically cancel all debts throughout their kingdoms to prevent the accumulation of unpayable obligations that could destabilize society through debt slavery and social unrest. These Jubilee years weren't acts of royal generosity, but practical economic policies designed to maintain political stability. The regular cancellation of debts encouraged lending and economic activity, while preventing the social disruption caused by extreme inequality. The system worked so well that it persisted for thousands of years across multiple civilizations, suggesting that ancient peoples understood economic principles that modern societies have forgotten or deliberately abandoned in favor of systems that concentrate rather than distribute wealth. Ancient Persian road systems achieved engineering feats that weren't matched until the construction of modern highways. The Royal Road stretched over 1,500 miles from Sardis to Susa, with relay stations every 15 miles, providing fresh horses and supplies for official messengers. The communication system was so efficient that messages could travel the entire length of the empire in just 7 days, a speed that wasn't achieved again until the invention of the telegraph. The roads were built with sophisticated drainage systems, bridges spanning major rivers, and tunnels carved through mountain ranges. But the most impressive aspect was the maintenance system. The Persians employed thousands of workers whose sole job was keeping the roads in perfect condition year-round. Damage from weather, traffic, or military action was repaired immediately, ensuring that communication and trade could continue without interruption. The roads were so well constructed that many sections remained in use for over 1,000 years after the Persian Empire collapsed. Roman engineers studied Persian road-building techniques and adapted them for their own highway system, acknowledging that Persian engineering surpassed their own in several important areas. Persian bridges represented engineering achievements that seem impossible given their available tools and materials. They built suspension bridges spanning gorges hundreds of feet deep, using cables woven from plant fibers and anchored to massive stone towers that required precision stone-cutting techniques we still don't fully understand. The psychological impact of these engineering projects was as important as their practical function. Travelers crossing Persian bridges or walking Persian roads were constantly reminded of the empire's power to reshape the natural world according to human will. As we reach deeper into the night, these shocking truths about ancient civilizations reveal just how complex, sophisticated, and often brutal our ancestors truly were. They developed technologies we can't replicate, practiced customs that horrify us, and achieved feats that challenge our understanding of human capability. The ancient world was a place where beauty and brutality coexisted, where profound wisdom lived alongside shocking ignorance, where humans created wonders and horrors in equal measure. These weren't primitive people stumbling through history, but complex societies with their own internal logic, moral frameworks, and incredible achievements. Their legacy lives on in ways we rarely recognize, influencing everything from our legal systems to our medical practices, from our architectural techniques to our understanding of human psychology. The past continues to shape the present in countless subtle ways, reminding us that we are not so different from those who came before us. Sleep well, knowing that human civilization has always been stranger, more wonderful, and more terrible than we dare to imagine. The ancestors who built our world were capable of both incredible beauty and shocking cruelty, often within the same breath. Ancient Spartan mothers had a saying that would chill modern parents to the bone. When sending their sons off to war, they would hand them their shield and say, "Come back with it, or on it." This wasn't just tough love, it was a death sentence for cowardice, because Spartan law demanded that soldiers who fled battle be executed by their own families. But here's what's truly shocking. Archaeological evidence shows that Spartan mothers would sometimes personally carry out these executions, stabbing their own sons to death in public ceremonies designed to preserve family honor. The psychological conditioning required to murder your own child for failing in battle reveals a mindset so alien to modern thinking that it barely seems human. Yet this was just the beginning of Spartan brutality. Every autumn, they declared war on their own slave population, the Helots, making it legal to kill them without trial or justification. Young Spartan warriors would roam the countryside at night, hunting Helots like wild animals in training exercises called the Krypteia. The most promising killers were rewarded with citizenship advancement, creating a society that literally bred psychopaths as a matter of state policy. The economic foundation of this system was even more disturbing. Helots outnumbered Spartans by nearly 10 to 1, meaning that the entire civilization existed in a state of constant terror about slave revolts. The random murders weren't just training exercises, but psychological warfare designed to keep the Helot population paralyzed with fear. Spartan children learned to participate in these killings from an early age, with boys as young as 12 expected to prove their courage by torturing captured Helots to death. The methods were deliberately creative, with points awarded for innovation in causing pain. Children who showed mercy or hesitation were beaten, and humiliated until they learned to enjoy inflicting suffering. But perhaps most shocking was that this system produced some of the most disciplined, effective soldiers in human history. The Spartan phalanx was virtually unbeatable for centuries, suggesting that systematic brutalization actually worked as military training, at least in terms of creating fearless warriors willing to die rather than retreat. Here's something that reveals the terrifying sophistication of ancient warfare. Assyrian siege tactics included psychological weapons so effective they could conquer cities without fighting. They would capture enemy soldiers and flay them alive in full view of city walls, hanging the skins as banners while keeping the victims conscious throughout the entire process. The flaying was performed by specialists who could remove human skin in single, intact pieces, creating grotesque trophies that would be displayed during negotiations with besieged cities. Assyrian artists became so skilled at this process that they could create intricate patterns and designs using human skin as their medium. But the psychological impact went beyond simple terror. Assyrians would force captured enemy leaders to watch while their children were slowly tortured to death, then blind them and send them back to their cities carrying detailed descriptions of what they had witnessed. These traumatized messengers became walking advertisements for Assyrian cruelty. The system was so effective that many cities surrendered immediately upon seeing Assyrian banners approach, rather than risk the horrific consequences of resistance. Entire populations would flee into the wilderness, abandoning their homes and possessions to avoid capture by armies that had turned torture into high art. Assyrian records describe the conquest of hundreds of cities through these psychological tactics alone, with minimal actual fighting required. They had weaponized human suffering so effectively that their reputation could destroy enemy morale before battles even began. Ancient Celtic druids possessed astronomical knowledge that seems impossible given their lack of written records or mathematical instruments. They could predict solar eclipses decades in advance, track planetary movements with accuracy that rivaled modern calculations, and coordinate religious festivals across vast distances using celestial timing that required sophisticated understanding of orbital mechanics. But they achieved this knowledge through methods that would horrify modern scientists. Druidic astronomical observations involved human sacrifice on a massive scale, with victims killed at precisely calculated moments during celestial events. The death throes of sacrificial victims were interpreted as divine messages containing information about future astronomical phenomena. The Druids believed that human consciousness expanded during the dying process, allowing sacrificial victims to perceive cosmic patterns invisible to the living. They developed elaborate techniques for prolonging death to maximize the information that could be extracted from dying minds, creating a scientific method based entirely on ritualized murder. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Druidic observatories required hundreds of human sacrifices per year to maintain their astronomical calculations. The victims were often volunteers who believed their deaths would grant them supernatural knowledge, creating a religious system where people competed for the privilege of being tortured to death for scientific purposes. The accuracy of Druidic predictions was so remarkable that Roman commanders would delay military campaigns rather than risk fighting on dates when Druid astronomers had predicted disaster. This gave Celtic astronomical knowledge genuine strategic value that influenced the course of ancient warfare. Let's discuss ancient Chinese foot binding, a practice so extreme it makes modern body modification look tame by comparison. The process began when girls were as young as 2 years old, with their toes broken and folded under the foot, then bound with strips of cloth that were tightened daily for years, until the foot measured only 3 to 4 inches long. The pain was so excruciating that many girls died from shock, infection, or gangrene during the binding process. Those who survived were permanently crippled, able to walk only with tiny, shuffling steps that required constant concentration to avoid falling. Yet this mutilation was considered the height of feminine beauty and was essential for marriage into respectable families. But here's what's truly shocking about foot binding. It wasn't imposed by men upon unwilling women. It was perpetuated by mothers who would personally break their daughters' feet, believing they were giving them the best possible chance for a successful life. The system was maintained by female cultural pressure, with women competing to achieve the most extreme foot deformation. The economic implications were staggering. Families would go into debt purchasing the specialized shoes, bandages, and medical care required for foot binding. Wealthy families employed professional foot binders who specialized in achieving particular shapes and sizes, creating an entire industry based on deliberate crippling of children. The practice was so embedded in Chinese culture that it persisted for over 1,000 years, despite repeated attempts by emperors and social reformers to ban it. Women with natural feet were considered unmarriageable, creating powerful social incentives that overrode concerns about health, mobility, or human rights. Ancient Roman gladiatorial schools operated using training methods that would be illegal even in modern military contexts. New gladiators were subjected to systematic brutalization, designed to destroy their normal human empathy and replace it with killing instinct that could be triggered on command. The process began with forced participation in the execution of other trainees who showed weakness or reluctance to fight. Gladiators who refused to kill their training partners were themselves executed, creating constant psychological pressure that broke down normal moral inhibitions against violence. But the most disturbing aspect was the sexual component of gladiator training. Male gladiators were routinely raped by their trainers and forced to participate in sexual violence against weaker trainees. This wasn't random abuse, but systematic psychological conditioning designed to associate violence with sexual arousal, creating fighters who became excited by inflicting pain. Female gladiators underwent different but equally horrific conditioning, including forced breeding programs designed to produce children who would inherit superior fighting ability. Pregnant gladiators were forced to fight until the moment of birth, with successful deliveries during combat considered omens of future victory. The psychological damage was so severe that many gladiators became unable to function in normal society, even if they won their freedom. Former gladiators had extremely high rates of suicide, violence against civilians, and mental breakdown that made them unemployable in peaceful occupations. Here's something that shows how different ancient concepts of justice were from ours. Persian courts employed professional lie detectors who claimed they could determine truth by examining the behavior of insects placed on suspects' bodies. These specialists would cover accused criminals with honey, then observe how different species of insects reacted to their presence. According to Persian legal theory, guilty individuals emitted spiritual emanations that influenced insect behavior in specific ways. Innocent people would be ignored by most insects, while criminals would attract swarms that would bite and sting them in patterns that trained observers could interpret as evidence of specific crimes. The process could last for days, with suspects bound helplessly while insects crawled over their bodies, biting and stinging according to their perceived guilt or innocence. Many died from insect venom or infected bites before their trials concluded, which was interpreted as divine judgment confirming their guilt. But Persian insect trials weren't random superstition. They were based on centuries of careful observation and documentation of insect behavior under different conditions. Persian legal scholars maintained detailed records of how various insects responded to different types of criminals, creating a sophisticated pseudoscience of entomological jurisprudence. The system was considered so reliable that Persian courts would accept insect testimony as superior to human witness accounts. Many suspects confessed rather than undergo insect trials, giving this bizarre practice genuine effectiveness as a method of legal intimidation. Ancient Egyptian mummification included procedures so sophisticated they surpass modern embalming techniques in some respects. Embalmers could preserve bodies so perfectly that skin texture, hair color, and facial expressions remained intact for thousands of years. But they achieved this through methods that involved systematic destruction of the brain while leaving other organs intact. The brain removal process was performed through the nose using long bronze hooks that would break up brain tissue and extract it in small pieces. This wasn't done because Egyptians didn't value the brain, but because they believed the heart was the center of consciousness, and the brain was merely cooling fluid for the blood. The irony is staggering. Egyptian embalmers developed the most sophisticated preservation techniques in human history, while fundamentally misunderstanding basic human anatomy. They could prevent decay for millennia while believing that thoughts originated in the chest rather than the head. But recent analysis of Egyptian mummies has revealed something even more disturbing. Many show evidence of being mummified while still alive, with brain removal performed on conscious victims who were paralyzed but not dead. The precision required suggests that live mummification was a deliberate process rather than accidental burial of comatose individuals. The psychological horror of being conscious during brain extraction through the nose, while unable to move or scream, represents a level of suffering that challenges our understanding of ancient medical practice. Yet Egyptian texts describe this as a merciful preparation for the afterlife that would ensure successful transition to eternal consciousness. Ancient Mayan ball games weren't just sports, but ritualized warfare that determined the fate of entire cities. The losing team would be systematically tortured to death in elaborate ceremonies that could last for days, with specific players assigned to different gods who required particular methods of sacrifice. The torture techniques were designed to maximize both physical suffering and spiritual significance. Players might be slowly flayed alive while conscious, with their skins used to create ritual garments worn by the winning team. Others would be buried alive in specially constructed chambers where they could be heard screaming for days as they slowly suffocated. But the most disturbing aspect was that many players volunteered for these death matches, believing that dying during the ball game would guarantee them privileged status in the afterlife. Entire families would compete for the honor of having their sons chosen for sacrificial games, viewing ritual death as the ultimate achievement. The economic impact was enormous, with cities investing vast resources in training players who were expected to die during competition. The ball courts themselves were architectural marvels that required sophisticated engineering to create acoustics that would amplify the screams of dying players throughout the surrounding area. Mayan astronomical calculations determined the timing and methods of these sacrificial games, with different torture techniques corresponding to specific celestial events. Players' deaths were choreographed to coincide with planetary alignments, creating a systematic calendar of ritualized murder that operated for centuries. Here's something that reveals the shocking sophistication of ancient biological warfare. Scythian archers would dip their arrows in a mixture of human blood, viper venom, and decomposing animal matter that created toxins more deadly than anything available until modern chemical weapons were developed. The preparation process took months, with specialized poisoners maintaining cultures of deadly bacteria in buried containers, where human corpses were allowed to rot under controlled conditions. The resulting toxin was so potent that even minor wounds would cause agonizing death within hours. But Scythians didn't just use poison arrows randomly. They developed sophisticated delivery systems, including specialized arrowheads designed to break off inside wounds, ensuring that poison would remain in victims' bodies even if the arrow shaft was removed. The psychological impact was devastating, as enemies knew that any wound from a Scythian arrow meant certain death. The production of these biological weapons required scientific knowledge that wouldn't be matched until the development of modern bacteriology. Scythian poisoners understood principles of toxicology, bacterial cultivation, and chemical preservation that allowed them to create weapons of mass destruction using only natural materials. The effectiveness was so terrifying that entire armies would retreat rather than face Scythian archers. The mere reputation of their poisoned arrows could determine the outcome of battles before fighting began, giving the Scythians military power, far beyond what their numbers alone could have achieved. Ancient Thracian warriors practiced ritual cannibalism that went far beyond simple consumption of enemy flesh. They believed that eating specific organs from defeated enemies would transfer their victims' courage, skills, and memories to the consumer, creating a systematic approach to acquiring supernatural abilities through cannibalism. The process was highly ritualized, with different body parts consumed at specific times and in particular combinations designed to maximize the transfer of desired qualities. Warriors would eat the hearts of brave enemies, the hands of skilled craftsmen, and the brains of intelligent opponents, believing they were literally incorporating their victims' abilities. But Thracian cannibalism extended beyond military contexts. They would consume their own dead relatives in elaborate funeral ceremonies, designed to prevent the deceased from becoming angry spirits while transferring their knowledge and personality traits to living family members. The preparation techniques were sophisticated, with specialized cooking methods designed to preserve the spiritual essence of consumed flesh while making it palatable. Thracian cooks developed elaborate recipes for human meat that were passed down through generations as sacred culinary traditions. The psychological impact on both practitioners and enemies was profound. Thracian warriors believed they carried the souls of everyone they had consumed, creating a form of multiple personality that made them unpredictable and terrifying opponents in battle. Let's talk about ancient Persian fire worship that involved practices so extreme they seemed designed by pyromaniacs. Zoroastrian priests would maintain eternal flames that burned continuously for centuries, fed with human fat rendered from sacrificial victims who were burned alive in elaborate ceremonies designed to honor the fire god. The human fuel was prepared through systematic fattening of sacrificial victims who were force-fed rich foods for months before being burned alive. The priests believed that well-nourished human fat produced flames with specific spiritual properties that were essential for maintaining contact with divine forces. But Persian fire ceremonies weren't just about burning people. They involved complex chemical processes that created flames of different colors and intensities, achieved through careful mixing of human fat with various minerals and plant extracts. The resulting fires were considered living beings that could communicate with worshippers through changes in flame color and movement. The most sacred flames required virgin sacrifices, with young women burned alive during their wedding ceremonies in rituals that combined marriage celebrations with human sacrifice. The brides were told they were being married to the fire god himself, creating a religious framework that made voluntary participation in their own immolations seem like spiritual privilege. These fire temples operated for centuries, consuming thousands of human victims whose rendered fat was stored in vast underground chambers that functioned as fuel depots for eternal flames. The scale of human sacrifice required to maintain these fires represents one of the most systematic forms of ritualized murder in human history. Ancient Celtic headhunting wasn't just about collecting trophies, but about creating supernatural weapons that could be used in future battles. Warriors believed that properly preserved human heads retained the consciousness and fighting ability of their original owners, allowing them to be consulted for strategic advice and used as psychological weapons against enemies. The preservation techniques were sophisticated, involving brain removal and replacement with special mixtures of herbs and animal fat that could maintain facial features and expressions for years. The heads were treated like living beings, given names, fed regular meals, and consulted for important decisions. But Celtic head cults went beyond simple preservation. They believed that collecting heads from specific types of enemies would grant supernatural powers to the collector. The head of a great warrior would provide courage, while the head of a wise druid would grant magical knowledge. The most powerful Celtic warriors would carry dozens of preserved heads into battle, creating mobile arsenals of supernatural weapons that supposedly provided magical protection and strategic guidance. The psychological impact on enemies who had to face warriors accompanied by the severed heads of their predecessors was devastating. Archaeological evidence shows that some Celtic settlements had specialized buildings designed specifically for head storage and consultation, with elaborate altars where preserved heads were displayed during religious ceremonies and strategic planning sessions. Here's something that shows how different ancient concepts of medicine were from ours. Roman physicians would deliberately infect patients with intestinal worms, believing that these parasites could consume diseased tissue while leaving healthy organs intact. The process involved feeding patients carefully prepared mixtures containing live parasite eggs. The worm therapy was based on detailed medical theories about how different parasites interacted with various diseases. Roman doctors developed elaborate protocols for introducing specific worm species to treat particular ailments, creating a sophisticated system of parasitic medicine that operated for centuries. But the most disturbing aspect was the breeding programs Romans maintained to produce medical-grade parasites. They operated facilities where human volunteers were deliberately infected with various worm species, then harvested for eggs and larvae that would be used to treat other patients. The volunteers for these parasite farms were often slaves or criminals who were promised freedom in exchange for serving as living incubators for medical worms. Many died from massive parasite infections, but Roman medical theory viewed these deaths as necessary sacrifices for the greater good of advancing medical knowledge. The effectiveness of parasite therapy was genuinely mixed, with some conditions actually improving while others became dramatically worse. Modern research has confirmed that certain parasites can indeed have therapeutic effects, giving Roman worm medicine accidental scientific validity despite being based on completely incorrect theories about disease causation. Ancient Assyrian siege warfare included psychological weapons so sophisticated they could conquer cities without fighting. They would capture enemy civilians and use them as living projectiles, launching them from catapults into besieged cities while keeping them alive during flight so their screams would demoralize defenders. The technical challenges of keeping people alive while launching them from siege engines required significant engineering innovation. Assyrians developed specialized harnesses and protective padding that could prevent immediate death from the launch process, while ensuring victims remained conscious during their flight into enemy territory. But the psychological impact went beyond simple terror. Assyrians would deliberately launch family members of city defenders, forcing them to watch their relatives flying overhead while being slowly killed by the impact. The emotional trauma often caused mass surrenders before siege engines could breach city walls. The practice became so effective that Assyrian armies would travel with portable catapult systems specifically designed for human projectiles. These weapons were lighter and more maneuverable than traditional siege engines, allowing rapid deployment of psychological warfare tactics during military campaigns. Assyrian records describe the conquest of hundreds of cities using these human projectile techniques, with minimal actual fighting required. They had weaponized human suffering so effectively that their reputation alone could destroy enemy morale before battles even began. Ancient Egyptian crocodile worship involved feeding live human sacrifices to sacred reptiles during elaborate ceremonies that could last for weeks. The sacrificial victims were specially prepared through months of ritual purification, designed to make their flesh more appealing to the crocodile gods. The feeding ceremonies were carefully choreographed spectacles, where victims would be slowly lowered into crocodile pools, while still conscious, allowing spectators to observe every detail of their consumption by sacred animals. The process was considered divine communion between human and animal consciousness, but Egyptian crocodile cults went beyond simple sacrifice. They believed that people consumed by sacred crocodiles would be reborn as divine beings with supernatural powers, creating religious incentives for voluntary participation in these feeding rituals. The most prestigious temples maintained hundreds of sacred crocodiles that required constant feeding with human flesh. The economic burden was enormous, with entire communities dedicated to providing sacrificial victims and maintaining the elaborate infrastructure required for crocodile worship. Archaeological evidence shows that some crocodile temples operated for over 1,000 years, consuming thousands of human sacrifices while maintaining detailed records of which victims produced the most favorable divine responses from the sacred reptiles. As we drift deeper into these shocking truths about ancient civilizations, the pattern becomes clear. Our ancestors weren't primitive people stumbling through history. They were complex, intelligent humans who developed sophisticated systems of thought and behavior that seem almost incomprehensibly alien to modern minds. They created technologies we can't replicate, practiced customs that horrify us, and achieved feats that challenge our understanding of human capability. The ancient world was a place where profound wisdom coexisted with shocking brutality, where scientific innovation flourished alongside ritualized murder, where humans created both wonders and horrors that continue to influence our world today. These weren't random acts of primitive savagery, but carefully developed cultural systems that operated according to their own internal logic. What seems shocking to us made perfect sense within the worldviews that produced them, reminding us that human nature itself is far more flexible and disturbing than we usually dare to acknowledge. The legacy of these ancient civilizations lives on in countless ways we rarely recognize, shaping everything from our legal systems to our medical practices, from our architectural techniques to our deepest psychological patterns. We are not separate from this history, but products of it, carrying within ourselves the same capacity for both transcendent achievement and unimaginable cruelty. Sleep well tonight, knowing that the depths of human civilization contain mysteries that make our wildest nightmares seem tame by comparison. Ancient Roman military engineers developed a siege technique so psychologically devastating that entire cities would surrender just from hearing about it. They called it the decimation wheel, a massive rotating apparatus that could slowly crush captured defenders while keeping them alive and conscious for hours as their screams echoed across battlefields. The wheel wasn't just a torture device, but a precision instrument of psychological warfare. Roman engineers calculated the exact pressure needed to break bones slowly without causing immediate death, creating prolonged agony that could be heard for miles. Enemy soldiers watching from city walls would witness their comrades being methodically destroyed while remaining fully aware throughout the entire process. But here's what makes this truly horrifying. The Romans didn't just use the wheel randomly. They would capture enemy commanders and torture them on the wheel while forcing their own soldiers to watch, breaking down military hierarchy and morale through systematic demonstration of what awaited anyone who continued to resist. The psychological conditioning was so effective that Roman armies could conquer fortified positions without siege engines or extended campaigns. The mere sight of decimation wheels being assembled outside city gates was often enough to trigger immediate surrender, giving Rome military advantages that shaped the entire course of Western civilization. Ancient Chinese execution methods achieved levels of sophisticated cruelty that modern minds can barely comprehend. The punishment known as lynching, or death by 1,000 cuts, involves systematic removal of body parts over periods that could last for days, while keeping victims conscious through carefully calculated doses of stimulants and pain enhancers. The executioners were highly trained specialists who apprenticed for years to master techniques that could prolong life while inflicting maximum agony. They understood human anatomy so precisely that they could remove fingers, toes, ears, and sections of skin in specific sequences designed to maintain consciousness and pain sensitivity throughout the entire process. But the most disturbing aspect was the audience participation. Public executions drew crowds of thousands who would cheer for particularly creative cuts, or boo executioners who worked too quickly. The events became social spectacles where families would bring children to learn about justice, while vendors sold snacks and souvenirs commemorating the torture. The economic impact was staggering, with entire industries developing around execution entertainment. Specialized seating was constructed for wealthy spectators. Programs were printed describing the crimes and planned torture sequences, and artists created detailed illustrations of execution techniques that were sold as educational materials. Chinese medical texts from this period describe Ling Qi as therapeutic for both the criminal and society, claiming that prolonged conscious suffering would purify the victim's soul while providing moral education for witnesses. The practice was considered so effective that it continued for over 1,000 years, despite repeated attempts at reform. Here's something that reveals the shocking sophistication of ancient biological warfare. Celtic druids developed poison recipes that could kill entire armies through contaminated water supplies, using combinations of plant toxins, bacterial cultures, and human waste that created weapons of mass destruction, centuries before modern chemical warfare was imagined. The preparation process required months of careful cultivation, with druids maintaining secret laboratories where deadly substances were bred and refined under controlled conditions. They understood principles of toxicology and bacteriology that wouldn't be rediscovered until the development of modern microbiology. But Celtic biological weapons weren't just about mass killing. Different poison formulations were designed to produce specific types of death, with some causing paralysis while maintaining consciousness, others inducing hallucinations and madness, and still others creating slow wasting diseases that could take months to kill their victims. The Druids would deliberately contaminate enemy food supplies with these biological agents, then withdraw to safe distances while entire populations died in agony. The psychological impact was devastating, as survivors never knew whether their next meal might be their last, creating terror that persisted long after actual poisoning campaigns had ended. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Celtic poison recipes were so effective they could kill hundreds of people with quantities small enough to carry in a single pouch. Roman commanders learned to fear Celtic druids more than entire armies, recognizing that a single poisoner could accomplish what thousands of warriors could not. Ancient Aztec priests practiced a form of human sacrifice that combined surgical precision with religious theater in ways that seemed too extreme to be real. During ceremonies honoring the god Tlaloc, they would slowly remove beating hearts from living victims, while keeping them conscious through the entire process, believing that awareness during heart extraction was essential for proper communication with divine forces. The surgical techniques were incredibly sophisticated, with priests training for decades to master procedures that could remove hearts without immediately killing victims. They understood human anatomy well enough to avoid major blood vessels and maintain circulation long enough for the heart to continue beating outside the body. But Aztec heart sacrifice wasn't just about religious devotion. The extracted hearts were used in elaborate cooking rituals where they would be prepared and consumed by priests and nobles while still warm from the victim's chest. The cannibalistic aspects were considered essential for transferring the victim's spiritual power to the consumers. The most prestigious ceremonies required hundreds of simultaneous heart extractions, with teams of priests working in choreographed sequences that could process entire populations of sacrificial victims during major religious festivals. The logistics required sophisticated organizational skills that rivaled modern surgical facilities. Aztec records describe ceremonies where over 1,000 people had their hearts removed in single days, with the extracted organs arranged in elaborate patterns that supposedly communicated messages to the gods. The scale of systematic murder required to maintain these religious practices represents one of the most organized forms of ritualized killing in human history. Let's discuss ancient Spartan infanticide practices that went far beyond the famous exposure of weak babies. Spartan society maintained professional child evaluators whose job was determining which infants deserved to live, using criteria that included not just physical strength, but psychological characteristics that could be assessed in newborns. These evaluators developed sophisticated techniques for testing infant reflexes, pain tolerance, and behavioral responses that supposedly predicted future warrior potential. Babies who failed these tests weren't just abandoned, but were subjected to systematic torture designed to confirm their unworthiness for Spartan citizenship. The testing process could last for weeks, with infants subjected to controlled starvation, exposure to extreme temperatures, and deliberate infliction of pain while observers recorded their responses. Only babies who demonstrated exceptional endurance and aggression would be accepted into Spartan society. But here's what makes this truly shocking. The evaluators weren't random officials, but specially trained experts who claimed they could predict adult personality characteristics from infant behavior patterns. They developed detailed classification systems that supposedly identified future cowards, traitors, and weaklings based on how babies responded to torture. The families whose children were rejected weren't just disappointed, but were considered contaminated by their production of inferior offspring. Parents of rejected infants faced social ostracism and reduced citizenship rights, creating powerful incentives for accepting even the most brutal evaluation procedures. Ancient Persian fire worship involved human combustion ceremonies that achieved levels of systematic burning that seem impossible without modern technology. Zoroastrian priests developed techniques for keeping sacrificial victims alive while slowly burning them over periods that could last for days, believing that prolonged conscious combustion was necessary for proper spiritual transformation. The burning process was carefully controlled using specialized equipment that could regulate flame intensity and heat distribution to prevent immediate death while maximizing suffering. Priests understood principles of thermal dynamics that allowed them to literally cook people alive while maintaining their consciousness throughout the entire process. But Persian fire ceremonies weren't just about individual sacrifice. They involved mass burning events where hundreds of victims would be simultaneously combusted in elaborate choreographed spectacles that combined religious devotion with entertainment for thousands of spectators. The most sacred ceremonies required virgin sacrifices who would be burned alive during their wedding ceremonies, creating ritualized events that combined marriage celebrations with human immolation. The brides were told they were being married to the fire god himself, making voluntary participation in their own burning seem like spiritual privilege rather than execution. These fire temples operated for centuries, consuming thousands of human victims whose ashes were collected and used in religious ceremonies throughout the Persian Empire. The scale of systematic burning required to maintain these practices represents one of the most organized forms of ritualized murder through combustion in human history. Here's something that shows how different ancient concepts of justice were from ours. Roman legal procedures included a practice called damnatio ad bestias, where convicted criminals would be thrown to wild animals in elaborate theatrical productions that could last for hours, while spectators bet on how long victims would survive. The animal executions weren't random feeding frenzies, but carefully choreographed spectacles where different beasts were selected based on the specific crimes committed. Thieves might be fed to bears, murderers to lions, while traitors were reserved for the most exotic and dangerous animals the empire could provide. But Roman beast executions went beyond simple feeding. Condemned criminals were often dressed as mythological characters and forced to reenact famous stories that ended with their actual deaths by animal attack. The theatrical elements made these executions popular entertainment that drew crowds comparable to modern sporting events. The logistics required sophisticated animal handling techniques, with professional beastmasters who specialized in training wild animals to kill humans in specific ways. Lions were taught to attack particular body parts first, while bears were conditioned to prolong the killing process to maximize entertainment value for spectators. Roman records describe executions where single criminals were attacked by multiple animals in sequence, with medical attendants standing by to treat wounds and keep victims conscious for as long as possible. The goal was creating spectacles that would last for hours while providing educational entertainment about the consequences of criminal behavior. Ancient Mayan astronomical calculations were achieved through systematic human sacrifice that used dying victims as living computers for predicting celestial events. Priests would torture sacrificial subjects, while observing their death throes for patterns that supposedly revealed information about planetary movements and eclipse timing. The process was based on beliefs that human consciousness expanded during the dying process, allowing victims to perceive cosmic patterns invisible to normal awareness. Mayan astronomers developed elaborate techniques for prolonging death while maintaining victim consciousness, creating human instruments for astronomical observation. But Mayan celestial sacrifice wasn't limited to individual victims. They conducted mass killing events timed to coincide with specific astronomical phenomena, believing that synchronized deaths during eclipses or planetary alignments would provide enhanced cosmic information. The most important ceremonies required sacrificial victims from enemy cities who would be slowly killed, while Mayan astronomers recorded the precise timing of their deaths in relation to celestial events. These records were used to create astronomical calendars that remained accurate for centuries. Archaeological evidence shows that some Mayan observatories were literally built on foundations of human bones, with the skeletal remains of thousands of sacrificial victims incorporated into the architectural structure of buildings designed for astronomical observation. Ancient Egyptian animal mummification reached scales of systematic preservation that seem impossible without industrial-level organization. They mummified literally millions of creatures, from cats and dogs to crocodiles and insects, creating vast necropolises that required enormous economic resources and specialized labor forces. The mummification process for sacred animals was often more elaborate than that used for human pharaohs, with some cats receiving gold jewelry, precious stone eyes, and wrappings made from the finest linen available in the ancient world. The economic value of a single mummified sacred cat could exceed the annual income of entire families. But recent analysis has revealed something shocking about Egyptian animal mummies. Many contain no animal remains whatsoever, instead being filled with sticks, stones, or random debris wrapped to simulate mummified creatures. This suggests that animal mummification had become such profitable business that fraud was widespread throughout the industry. The implications are staggering. Devout Egyptians would pay enormous sums for mummified animals they believed would intercede with gods on their behalf, only to receive bundles of garbage wrapped in expensive linen. Yet the practice continued for centuries, indicating either massive deception or acceptance that symbolic offerings were spiritually equivalent to genuine ones. Egyptian priests operating these mummification industries became incredibly wealthy, with some temple complexes employing thousands of embalmers, animal handlers, and craftsmen whose sole job was producing fake animal mummies for religious consumers who never suspected they were being systematically defrauded. Let's talk about ancient Chinese foot binding that went far beyond simple beauty modification to become systematic crippling of entire female populations. The process involved breaking every toe except the big one, then folding them under the foot and binding them so tightly that bones would fuse into permanently deformed shapes measuring only 3 to 4 inches long. The pain was so excruciating that many girls died from shock during the initial bone-breaking process, while others succumbed to infections or gangrene caused by the tight bindings that cut off blood circulation. Those who survived were permanently disabled, requiring assistance for basic activities like walking or standing. But here's what makes foot binding truly horrifying. It wasn't imposed by men upon unwilling women, but was perpetuated by mothers who would personally break their daughters' feet, believing they were providing the best possible opportunities for successful marriage and social advancement. The psychological conditioning required to systematically cripple your own children reveals mindsets so alien to modern thinking that they challenge our understanding of parental psychology. Mothers would ignore their daughters' screams and pleas while methodically breaking bones, viewing this torture as an act of love rather than abuse. The practice was so embedded in Chinese culture that it persisted for over 1,000 years, despite repeated attempts by emperors and social reformers to ban it. Women with natural feet were considered unmarriageable, creating social pressures that overrode concerns about health, mobility, or human suffering. Ancient Thracian warriors practiced ritual cannibalism that went far beyond simple consumption of enemy flesh to include systematic eating of their own family members during funeral ceremonies designed to prevent the dead from becoming vengeful spirits. The cannibalistic funeral process was highly ritualized, with different body parts consumed at specific times, and in particular combinations designed to transfer the deceased person's knowledge and personality traits to living relatives. Family members would eat the brains of intelligent relatives, the hearts of brave ones, and the hands of skilled craftsmen. But Thracian cannibalism extended beyond funeral contexts to include therapeutic consumption of human flesh for treating various diseases. They believed that eating specific organs from healthy people could cure corresponding ailments in sick individuals, creating medical practices based entirely on cannibalistic treatment protocols. The preparation techniques were sophisticated, with Thracian cooks developing elaborate recipes for human meat that were passed down through generations as sacred culinary traditions. Different cooking methods were believed to preserve or enhance the spiritual properties of consumed flesh. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Thracian settlements maintained specialized kitchens designed specifically for preparing human meat, with cooking equipment and storage facilities that indicate cannibalism was a regular rather than occasional practice in these communities. Here's something that reveals the terrifying sophistication of ancient psychological warfare. Assyrian armies would capture enemy children and train them as weapons against their own parents, conditioning them through systematic torture and indoctrination to become enthusiastic participants in the destruction of their birth communities. The child conditioning process could take years, with captured youngsters subjected to carefully designed psychological manipulation that broke down their original identities and replaced them with fanatical loyalty to Assyrian military commanders, who became their new parental figures. These weaponized children were particularly effective because their original families would hesitate to harm them during combat, giving Assyrian forces significant tactical advantages in battles where former family members faced each other across opposing battle lines. But the most disturbing aspect was that many of these children genuinely came to prefer their Assyrian captors over their original families, viewing their birth communities as enemies who had failed to protect them from capture and subsequent indoctrination. Assyrian records describe military campaigns where entire units consisted of children fighting against their own ethnic groups, with former family members serving as frontline troops in the conquest of their birth regions. Ancient Celtic druids developed astronomical prediction methods that required systematic torture of sacrificial victims during specific celestial events, believing that human suffering could influence cosmic forces and provide information about future astronomical phenomena. The torture-based astronomy was conducted in specialized observatory buildings where victims would be slowly killed while druids observed the sky for changes that supposedly corresponded to the intensity and duration of human suffering being inflicted below. Different torture techniques were believed to provide information about different types of celestial events, with flaying alive used for predicting eclipses, while burning was reserved for tracking planetary movements. The screams of victims were interpreted as cosmic communications containing astronomical data. The accuracy of druidic astronomical predictions achieved through these methods was remarkable enough that Roman commanders would delay military campaigns rather than risk fighting on dates when Celtic astronomers had predicted disaster through their torture-based calculations. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Celtic astronomical observations required continuous human sacrifice over periods lasting for months, with victims being kept alive and conscious while undergoing prolonged torture that supposedly provided ongoing cosmic information. As these shocking truths about ancient civilizations continue to unfold, one thing becomes crystal clear. Our ancestors possessed capabilities for both transcendent achievement and unimaginable cruelty that far exceeded anything we typically associate with primitive peoples stumbling through prehistoric darkness. They developed technologies we still can't replicate. created artistic masterpieces that continue to inspire wonder, and achieved scientific insights that anticipated modern discoveries by thousands of years. Yet these same civilizations also practiced systematic cruelty on scales that challenge our understanding of human psychology and social organization. The ancient world wasn't a simpler, more innocent time, but a complex landscape where profound wisdom coexisted with shocking brutality, where scientific innovation flourished alongside ritualized murder, where humans created both magnificent wonders and horrific systems of suffering that operated for centuries with the same efficiency we associate with modern institutions. These weren't random acts of primitive savagery, but carefully developed cultural practices that made perfect sense within the worldviews that produced them. What seemed shocking to modern sensibilities represented sophisticated solutions to problems we can barely comprehend, reminding us that human nature itself contains depths we usually prefer not to acknowledge. The legacy of these ancient civilizations continues shaping our modern world in ways we rarely recognize, influencing everything from legal principles to medical practices, from architectural techniques to the deepest patterns of human psychology. We carry within ourselves the same capacity for both transcendent achievement and systematic cruelty that characterized our ancestors. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, let these incredible revelations settle into your consciousness. The past holds secrets that continue reshaping our understanding of what humans are capable of achieving, creating, and enduring. History isn't just a collection of dates and names, but a vast repository of human experience that reveals the true complexity of our species. Sweet dreams, and remember that the ancient world was far stranger, more sophisticated, and more disturbing than we ever dared imagine. The people who built our civilization were capable of wonders and horrors that continue echoing through time, reminding us that human potential extends far beyond the boundaries we usually dare to explore. The ancient world holds one final secret that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about human civilization itself. Deep beneath the sands of time lies evidence of achievements so impossible. They seem to defy the very laws of physics and human capability. In the windswept valleys of Peru, archaeologists discovered something that shouldn't exist. Stone blocks weighing over 200 tons, cut with precision that surpasses modern laser technology, fitted together so perfectly that not even a razor blade can slide between the joints. These aren't crude constructions held together by luck and determination. These are engineering marvels that required mathematical knowledge and construction techniques we supposedly didn't develop until the space age. But here's what makes this truly mind-bending. The stones were quarried from mountainsides hundreds of miles away, then somehow transported across impossible terrain without wheels, without pulleys, without any of the machinery we consider essential for such tasks. Ancient engineers accomplished what modern construction companies would consider impossible, even with today's most advanced equipment. The precision cuts show no tool marks, no evidence of the gradual shaping process that stone carving requires. Instead, these massive blocks appear to have been shaped using methods that left surfaces smoother than glass, with internal corners carved to tolerances that modern machinery can barely achieve. It's as if the stone was somehow softened, molded like clay, then hardened back into its final form. Recent analysis using electron microscopes has revealed something even more disturbing. The molecular structure of these ancient stones shows evidence of vitrification, a process that occurs only under extreme temperatures exceeding 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet there's no evidence of the massive furnaces that would have been required to generate such heat. The stones appear to have been heated from within, using energy sources that conventional archaeology cannot explain. This isn't isolated to Peru. Similar impossible stonework appears across the globe in locations so distant from each other that ancient peoples supposedly had no contact. Egypt, Easter Island, Cambodia, Lebanon, all feature megalithic construction that demonstrates identical impossible techniques. suggesting either worldwide ancient communication networks or technologies that mainstream history refuses to acknowledge. Ancient texts from these civilizations describe the construction process using language that seems more like science fiction than historical record. They speak of stones that walk themselves into position, of sounds that could levitate massive objects, of devices that could soften rock like butter. Modern academics dismiss these as mythological metaphors, but what if they were literal descriptions of technologies we've forgotten how to create? The implications are staggering. If ancient peoples possessed engineering capabilities that exceed our own, what other knowledge have we lost to time? What other achievements have been buried beneath centuries of conventional thinking that insists human progress follows a linear path from primitive to advanced? Standing before these impossible monuments, feeling the perfect smoothness of surfaces that shouldn't exist, one cannot escape the conclusion that our ancestors were far more sophisticated than we dare admit. They accomplished feats that challenge not just our understanding of ancient history, but our very conception of what human beings are capable of achieving. The ancient world wasn't populated by primitive people struggling with stone tools and limited knowledge. It was home to civilizations that possessed secrets we're still trying to rediscover. Technologies that make our modern achievements seem crude by comparison. Wisdom that we've only begun to glimpse through the cracks in our carefully constructed historical narratives. Tonight, as these incredible truths settle into your consciousness, remember that the past continues to hold mysteries that dwarf our wildest imaginings. The people who came before us left behind evidence of capabilities that shouldn't have existed, achievements that rewrite everything we thought we knew about the progression of human civilization. The ancient world was stranger, more advanced and more mysterious than we ever dared believe. And perhaps, in our rush to congratulate ourselves on modern progress, we've forgotten that we're not the first humans to reach for the impossible and make it real. Sweet dreams, and rest well knowing that human potential has always exceeded the boundaries we try to impose upon it.